I'm going to do a model oral presentation on the additional readings for week one. And the week one readings are a reading by Langbein, a reading by Linebaugh. You can see the whole references in the syllabus. And the debate between Langbein and Linebaugh is over whether the 18th century criminal justice system was a class tool, a tool of the ruling class to oppress the poor. And Linebaugh says yes, that the legal system works to enforce new property relations, to defend the interests of a property elite against the mass of poor people. And Langbein says no, the system worked to protect the interests of victims of crime, most of whom are non-elite. It is not a class tool, according to Langbein. So let's start with Langbein. Langbein organizes his argument around a critique of the Hay reading that everyone had in their required readings for topic one. And he's got a lot of criticisms of Hay, but I want to focus on two of them. The first is a description of the crimes. Langbein says the crimes that we see for the most part are things that had been recognized as crimes for centuries before the 18th century and that we would recognize as crime. They're mostly theft. The victims are not wealthy. They were small property holders, small employers, and the criminals are not very sympathetic in Langbein's view. They were people stealing from their employers or their slightly wealthier neighbors. Most defendants were thieves who should have been prosecuted, and the system worked because it brought these people to justice. The second piece is the jury system. And Langbein argues that juries had a great deal of influence on how these cases played out. They had a wide discretion to let people off, or what he focuses on mostly is doing something called issuing a partial verdict. And that means convicting the defendant on a lesser charge than the one they start with. And this allows them to avoid the threat of the death penalty. He argues that these juries are not part of the property elite, they're not part of the ruling class, and we have these independent, non-elite juries that are making the key decisions in the justice system. He says if we're trying to create a system that is defending the interest of the ruling class against the mass of people, you wouldn't put this piece, these juries with a lot of discretion, into play because they can really do whatever they want and they're hard to be controlled by the wealthy. The evidence and sources that Langbein uses are mostly trial records from the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court in London. He has the Old Bailey published accounts called the Session Papers, and he's also got, for a very brief period, a notebook that had a judge's records of the crime, the judge's own notes on the crime. So again, he's arguing that 18th century law was not class-based. Rather, we see what we would recognize as criminals being brought to justice in a system that worked in a rational and humane way, particularly through the impact of juries. Now, Linebaugh rejects Langbein's argument, and we're going to focus on the same two pieces, the juries and the cases themselves. So let's start with the juries. Linebaugh argues that actually the juries were part of the elite, that very few people, in terms of percentage, had enough property to serve on the jury. Poor people could not serve on the juries. And these people who served on the juries were small property holders who were allied with and dependent on the real rich people who were managing the system. And he finds that there were a lot of people who served on juries repeatedly, who were almost like professional jurors, and they were paid and manipulated by the wealthy elite. So he doesn't see the juries working as this kind of independent democratic check on the power of the wealthy, but rather as a way that the wealthy elites could manipulate the system through these juries, and it wasn't the poor people who were serving on the juries. It was small property holders who had strong ties to the wealthy ruling class. His view of the cases themselves was to look at specific cases rather than the broad categories that Langbein had said, oh, lots of people were charged with theft. Linebaugh says if we look at particular cases, what we find is charges for theft in ways that reflect changing expectations and changing property relations. A lot of people were brought to trial for stealing from their employers in ways that Linebaugh says were allowed customarily. There were a lot of privileges that came with working in certain industries where you were allowed to kind of take home the scraps, the extra material, stuff that was around. And in the 18th century, employers want to stop this and define this stuff as their property that workers couldn't take home anymore. And so they began to bring these people to trial for taking home bits of wool if they were working in a weaving shack, things like that. A modern analogy might be like if you work in an office and there's a supply closet, and you go and you take some pens, not to use in your office and your work, but to bring home and have at home. Right? You might say, well, that's just a privilege of working in an office with a supply closet. You get to go and use the pens. Right? Or you might say, well, that's stealing. And Leinenbaugh's argument is a jury who's made up of low-level workers who are taking pens from the office closet might not convict someone for stealing if they took some pens home. Right? But a middle manager whose job it is to handle the budget and decide where we find the money to buy the pens might say this is theft, and this person should be prosecuted, charged with theft. Leinenbaugh is using the same Old Bailey trials, but he's looking at the specifics of each case, where Langbein looked in general at the overall breakdown of what the charges were. So Leinenbaugh's conclusion was that if we look more detailed way at the juries and the cases, we see the law operating to protect new forms of property ownership, the interest of a property elite against the mass of propertyless poor. So the question is, was the law a tool of the ruling class in the 18th century? And Leinenbaugh says yes, it was, and Langbein says it was not.